Good evening, blog viewers. We're going to continue with our posts on moderation, our series on moderation, and critically distinguishing the conception of moderation that we have been focusing on here from sort of a common view of moderation. We'll start out talking about that. And sort of the one way to view moderation, typically commonly viewed, is sort of pulling back from certain aspects of our personality, sort of becoming tamer and more gentle and more pursuing things in a less heated way. And the conception of moderation that we've been talking about here is slightly different. Rather than sort of pulling back from certain aspects of our personality, it's more a matter of sort of bringing all the different aspects of our personality into play, and then seeking to create a self that harmonizes those different aspects as best as it can, without any single aspect being avoided or ignored or destroyed in the process. And that is sort of the conception of moderation, and the challenge, the very difficult challenge of bringing all those capacities to their max pitch, and then keeping them stably together in a life. You could think of someone, for example, that has an anger management issue or anger problem. That person could become, let's say that anger issue arises in the context of social interactions. Now that person can pursue moderation by just becoming a hermit and never talking to people, but that is a conception of moderation that has sort of given up so much of what's essentially good for that person. Rather, that person should try to harmonize and control his anger in the context of society, and not sort of buy moderation at the price of giving up on social interaction and social discourse, which is good for him. And so this conception of moderation, as we'll see, and we'll look at Nietzsche again today, because he has some very interesting ideas about moderation and how to achieve sort of that version of moderation that we've been discussing, which is bringing all the different capacities to their perfected point and then harmonizing them. And Nietzsche talks about that in his book, The Will to Power, and I'm using again the Walter Kaufmann translation. And in the Will to Power, Will to Power was actually a series of aphorisms and notations in Nietzsche's notebooks, which were put together after he died. Apparently, he was working on this book. It was never actually complete the way Nietzsche wanted, but the book was still put together after his death, and I think by his sister. And so, in The Will to Power, of course, obviously the title has been misinterpreted, and a lot of Nietzsche's ideas on the will to power have been misinterpreted over time. Fundamentally, and we'll go through a lot of the passages today to bring this out, Nietzsche did not mean by, he fundamentally regarded life, one of his main ideas was life was fundamentally about the individual person perfecting this will to power and gaining power in the sense that he thought was best. But he did not, in many passages, he stressed that the power that he was talking about was not power over other people, it was not the power of ambition or lust, or the power of fame, or seeking various sorts of fame, but was fundamentally a power in the own person's being. It was a power to control oneself, to bring, to strengthen oneself, to perfect oneself, and do that all in a way that the power that was coming was from the individual person. That power, it was not power that the person was taking from outside, but it was power that was being generated within. It was perfecting man, it was good for man, and it was and then fundamentally it was then perfecting man in his different capacities that were being all strengthened. And for Nietzsche, again, so his views on the will to power fit within our conception of moderation that we were talking about, because for Nietzsche, the will to power was, again, this individual's creative impulses to create a self to create a self that harmonized the different aspects of his existence, the various things that had happened to him in his past, the various hopes he had for the future, the various social forces operating on his life, and the will to power were sort of Nietzsche's attempt to put a label on a concept that took all of these things that happened to man, the past, the present, future hopes, social forces operating on one, the talents one had, the abilities one had, and take all that and harmonize it and bring it to perfection and power within an individual self that was assured of itself, that was strong, that knew what was good for it, and that sort of self-legislated. And that fits very well into our conception of moderation. So we'll talk about Nietzsche's ideas here on that. Now, throughout Will to Power, Nietzsche gives various descriptions of what he means by this sort of person that is perfected, sort of the will to power, once we understand the term correctly. He says there is nothing better than what is good, and good is having some ability and using that to create virtue in the Italian Renaissance sense. That is at aphorism 75. He goes on to say at 266 that he questions to what extent morality has been detrimental to life, and he questions to what extent it's been detrimental to the enjoyment of life, to gratitude toward life, to the beautifying, ennobling of life, to knowledge of life, to the development of life insofar as it sought to set the highest phenomena of life at variance with itself. And then later, even later than that, he says at 674, he says the entire conscious life of man, the spirit along with the soul, the heart, goodness and virtue, in whose service do they labor? In the service of the greatest possible perfection of the means, of the basic animal functions, above all, the enhancement of life. And then again here at 585, he says, it is a measure of the degree of strength of will, to what extent one can do without meaning in things, to what extent one can endure to live in a meaningless world, because one organizes a small portion of it oneself. So in these passages and in other passages in Will to Power, Nietzsche describes a person that is organizing reality, organizing what has happened to him, organizing a world that's otherwise sort of disordered and chaotic, and he's sort of organizing it himself. He's seeking his own perfection. He is turning toward life and turning toward the natural goodness of life and the ennobling of life in the right sense. He is turning toward sort of perfecting his different capacities, and all of that gets sort of labeled, and his creative capacities, and all of that for Nietzsche was part of the will to power, part of what was good about man's creative impulses. Now, none of this has anything to do, as we stressed in the beginning, about man ruling over other people, about man seeking sort of fame in the world from other people, sort of unbridled ambition. Nietzsche's ideas have been thought and have been misinterpreted, and to some extent because his writing has been so chaotic in so many areas, and has not, and Nietzsche sort of set himself up for being misinterpreted. But fundamentally, I think if you sort of focus on Nietzsche's ideas carefully, I think you see that he's not calling for perfection or power over other people, but fundamentally locating the will to power again in the perfection of oneself. At 721, he says, he talks about various ways that people wrongly pursue power in the world, and he says he labels men who want power for the sake of the happiness power provides political parties. Other men who want power, even accompanied by obvious disadvantages and sacrifices in happiness and well-being, the ambitious. So he didn't view sort of the lust for political power or the lust for or sort of ambition gone wild, either of those as being the right way to pursue the will to power. He says later at 704, man becomes master over the forces of nature, master over his own savagery and licentiousness. The desires have learned to obey and be useful. And man, in comparison with a pre-man, represents a tremendous quantum of power. So again, power over the savagery within us, power over sort of the licentiousness between us, and all of that fit within Nietzsche's conception of gaining power over the self. And even later on than that, he says his age at the time possesses the reverse instincts. It wants first and above all comfort. It wants in the second place publicity and that great actor's hubbub, that great drum banging that appeals to its funfair taste. So he was again criticizing the conception of power that sought either comfort or sort of a fame in the world. He didn't see that as being the point of the will to power. So fundamentally, Nietzsche saw, again, will to power as being gaining power over sort of destructive tendencies in our personality, gaining power over the forces, social forces that operated on us that were not good for us, gaining power over one's creative impulses and using and harnessing that. And all of these things Nietzsche thought were again in danger by two fundamental tendencies that I think we talked about previously. One danger for man was nihilism, and for Nietzsche, under Nietzsche's view, and another was sort of an automatic autopilot sort of functioning, which he calls automatism. And Nietzsche viewed both of these things as representing a threat to the will to power. When these things Nietzsche viewed, when nihilism and sort of an automatic autopilot functioning in life operated, then the will to power was stunted. The will to power could not grow. The person could not gain sort of the mastery of the self that Nietzsche celebrated so insistently. And Nietzsche thought that his time, again, was one that was, as we saw in genealogy, was one that nihilism was a threat. And he says at 55, one interpretation of the world has collapsed, but because it was considered the interpretation, it now seems as if there were no meaning at all in existence, as if everything were in vain. That this in vain constitutes the character of present-day nihilism remains to be shown. The mistrust of our previous valuation grows until it becomes the question, are not all values lures that draw out the comedy without bringing it closer to a solution? So there Nietzsche is saying, I think, that there was a certain value to the world hundreds of years ago where people sort of had very certain metaphysical beliefs about the world and their place in it. That interpretation collapsed, and because it seemed like the dominant interpretation at the time, now there's nothing in its place. There's nothing that seems valuable, and now everything seems like it's in vain, and people sort of turn back against the very project of creating values because it seems like all values are sort of empty and hopeless and meaningless anyway. And so that was Nietzsche's concern with nihilism, that because one interpretation had collapsed, nothing had taken its place, and people sort of turned back on the whole project of searching for one's values, as he often said. And so we get a sense of that at 55. We get another sense of it at 68. Nietzsche says the profound instinct that only automatism makes possible perfection in life and creation. So there is a certain view now that sort of this automatic, repetitive, rote functioning in the world is the only sort of thing that can bring any sort of perfection in life and creation. He viewed that as also a danger. At 141, he says, let's see here. He says, in summa, what is the price of moral improvement? unhinging of reason, reduction of all motives to fear and hope, dependence upon pedantic formalities which claim to express a divine will, the implanting of a conscience which sets a false knowing in place of testing and experiment, as if what should be done and what left undone had already been determined, a kind of castration of the seeking and forward striving spirit. In summa, the worst mutilation of man that can be imagined, present as the good man. So again, the nihilistic spirit was one where people had sort of given up on questioning and testing and experimenting on their own values, had sort of given up on sort of a seeking, forward-moving, forward-striving spirit, and all of this had, in Nietzsche's views, been sort of a mutilation, a destruction of man. He says later at 247, again, so a sort of a slow suicide of life where life becomes more petty, more poor, more ordinary, more mediocre. Again, this was a threat to someone that wanted to perfect his self, perfect his gain mastery over the self, and perfect the will to power. Again, at 269, Nietzsche writes, my idea, goals are lacking, and these must be individuals. We observe how things are everywhere. Every individual is sacrificed and serves as a tool. Go into the street and you encounter lots of slaves. Whither? For what? So again, goals are lacking. Individuals must come up with their own goals, and that for Nietzsche was the most important thing of all. Again, the nihilistic spirit sort of prevented that. So there's various ways now that Nietzsche suggested we could overcome nihilism, and we could sort of overcome this sort of automatic functioning in life. And the one thing that he stressed more than anything was the importance of sort of creativity. He thought that there were the creative impulse was one of the most important, and that various other ways to pursue creativity in the world, things that were otherwise good in the world, he thought were only good insofar as they helped perfect this creativity of individual people. There was almost no limit in Nietzsche's view to the creative impulse of man, how far man could create, how far he could sort of push creativity forward, and everything else that was good, that could be good. I think Nietzsche viewed it as good only insofar as it furthered that creativity. He talks about wealth. He says the problem with wealth nowadays is that even the wealthy, he says, even the rich are the poorest of all. The true purpose of all riches is forgotten. That's at 61. And he hints at one reason that the one way that people use wealth is to wage a sort of war against any accidental distress and any disagreeable possibility. So sort of pursuing comfort again beyond any level of reason, sort of trying to eliminate any sort of risk in their life and any sort of negative outcome. He didn't view that as serving sort of the creative impulse. Later on, again, he says, in terms of culture and education, these things, again, if they enabled people and if they made push people's creativity, Nietzsche viewed it as a good thing. But if they didn't, he viewed it as a bad thing. In 109, a critical quote, he says, "There is an element of decay in everything that characterizes modern man. But close beside this sickness stand signs of an untested force and powerfulness of the soul. The same reasons that produce the increasing smallness of man drive the stronger and rare individuals up to greatness." That's at 109. He says at 110, to generalize, feelings about values are always behind the times. They express conditions of preservation and growth that belong to times long gone by. They resist new conditions of existence with which they cannot cope and which they necessarily misunderstand. Thus, they inhibit and arouse suspicion against what is new. So here again, Nietzsche is saying that the creativity of man is a good thing, but that there's all these other elements, or there's elements of decay in sort of even in things like culture and education. Culture and education, if they sort of push forward and celebrate man's creativity, are good. If they cause decay in man, if they cause sort of a sickness in man, then they're not good. These are not things that are, in Nietzsche's views, helping us create that sort of moderate, splendid strength in self. And we get that at 110 again. He says at 134, the condition of every enhancement of culture, making possible a selection at the expense of a mass, are the conditions of all growth. So I think he means there again, there are things in the culture, there are things in education that allow for that must be selected out. They must be chosen from the mass of things available in the culture, the mass of things available in education, that actually help man grow and strengthen himself. And we have to figure out what those things are, because those things are going to perfect man, and other things within the culture, as Nietzsche, we saw at 110 what he said, that there are things in the culture that decay, but that behind those things often we can find things that strengthen. And the last sort of concern Nietzsche had is this thought that as our life already is, everything is already perfect. There's everything is perfect as it is, that one is fully justified as one is. We don't have to do anything. You don't have to sort of push yourself further and improve and grow. You're as you are. You're perfected as you are. And Nietzsche saw that as being sort of a dangerous philosophy, dangerous viewpoint on things, because we sort of just get stuck. There's no wanting to get better. There's no striving forward, and he saw that as sort of being a view in the culture of being pernicious, of being dangerous for people, of not wanting to improve and not wanting to grow. He says, one does not by any means deserve a privileged position on earth and in heaven by attaining perfection. As a little good-natured sheep, one remains at best a little good-natured absurd sheep. So again, life is viewed for Nietzsche as a path, as a growth, as a route to power over the self, growth of the self, enabling of the self in ways that serve life and man's creativity, and views that by just sort of being passive and sort of being a contented sort of good-natured sheep, as Nietzsche puts it, that things will just work out for you magically. He thought that was sort of a pretty pernicious view. So in general, I think we get a sense of what Nietzsche was concerned about, what he thought were certain problems and certain issues with pursuing moderation in contemporary society, certain paths. And I think positively we see Nietzsche celebrating again this creativity and surpassing of sort of the bad elements in each of our characters, sort of moving beyond those things. But Nietzsche, I think, interestingly, I think sort of while he diagnoses certain problems with nihilism and automatism and things of that sort, but he seems to sort of lack the ability to sort of articulate solutions to these things beyond celebrating man's creativity, which he never really describes in detail. And so I think there are lots of questions here that still need to be answered. Nietzsche doesn't really describe, doesn't really give us a criterion at all to judge different forms of creativity. Are all forms of creativity equal? Are they all as good for the person as some other thing? I'm not sure that's proven or that's shown by Nietzsche at all. You can think of a creative scheme to defraud other people, a creative scheme to somehow make it so that all you have to do is just sit at home all day and watch movies. There's just so many permutations. Not all creativity seems equal. And Nietzsche doesn't prove that it is at all. And more than that, not all creativity seems to result in the enabling of man and the ennobling of man in the ways that Nietzsche seems to just assume will happen. More than that, is the task of creating and creating something that Nietzsche prizes in such a way. Is this and the difficult struggle of overcoming all these tendencies that we have that may not be so good? Is that worth? Is it a solution to the problem that's worse than the actual? Is the solution worse than the actual problem? We don't really sort of this automatic type of functioning and this sort of nihilistic belief about everything. Does that justify sort of the sort of self-overcoming that Nietzsche seems to celebrate so much? Does that justify all of the things that Nietzsche seems to call for? I'm not sure that it does. And I think part of that is Nietzsche persistently fails to see sort of the intrinsic value and goodness of things in life that can be called small pleasures. I think he was right to point out that a life that solely consisted of pursuing small pleasures would be problematic. But I think he was sort of blind to a lot of the joys, a lot of the insights, a lot of the development that can happen in man in just the simplest things, like having a conversation with a friend, having certain experiences that are out of the ordinary for one, taking certain vacations or trips and things of that sort. Nietzsche seems to not at all consider that in those things one can be moved, one can have certain experiences that really affect one and that fundamentally change one's orientation on the world, and result in a sort of creativity that of its own. Nietzsche seemed to not even take that idea seriously. So I think what happens here with moderation in our own life is that Nietzsche gets things started, I think, for us by showing us that sort of the challenge is to create a self that really takes control over all of these different tendencies in our lives that can cripple us. And in that sense, he has a very strong conception of moderation as being a sort of power over these destructive tendencies in us. But I'm not sure he gives solutions that are very workable for most people. And I think we need to think about areas of our life where we may need to pursue moderation. We need to think about realistic assessments of the problem, realistic assessments of what actually needs to be moderated, finding attainable solutions in that regard for whatever it is that we haven't been moderate, and seeking solutions that are good fits to the problem and they don't cause their own sort of endless problems in its own right. I'm not sure Nietzsche does that. I think these are important things that need to be thought through for all of us about how to seek that level of moderation, how to seek that level of perfection and bringing everything together in the right way. But I'm not sure Nietzsche's sort of endless celebration of creativity quite does the trick. It plays little. First of all, it's too vague on exactly what kind of creativity is to be preferred, and more than that, it gives it hardly any regard for man's sort of social framework that he's set up in, and how to balance man's desire for and need for creativity and self-expression with man's already living in a society, in a framework of a life that already has a lot sort of fixed as it is. So I think Nietzsche sort of diagnoses the problems that stand in the way of sort of of perfecting that will to power that he prizes and seems to have so many good attributes in it. But I think the solution is left very vague, and I think the solution of creativity by itself seems, in the end, a little too easy. So we'll talk to you soon. Bye bye.